Hi class, how are you today? That's less than great. I was really expecting much more from you. The learning target for today is to solve inequalities using the properties of inequality. So, last lesson we learned about solving equations using the properties of equality. Now we're going to solve inequalities using the properties of inequality. So, very similar to solving equations, just with the inequality sign, as you should remember from last year. However, we're going to put it in the table again, just like we did with the equations, and we're going to state the properties of inequality we use each time. Scale, you're a 3 if you can solve inequalities and state which property was used. 2, you can solve inequalities, but you have trouble remembering when to flip the inequality sign. So as we'll get into, remember you flip it if the variable's on the other side, where you flip the whole inequality, or you flip the inequality sign when you multiply or divide both sides by a negative number. 1, you know the properties of inequality, but you cannot solve inequalities. And 0, you do not know the properties of inequality and cannot solve inequalities. Let's get started. Alright, so first we're going to start with the addition property of inequality, which says if x is less than y, then x plus some number c is also less than y plus c. So if we add the same number to both sides, just like with equations, the inequality still stands. And that also works for the other sign. So if you say if x is greater than y, then x plus c will be greater than y plus c. The subtraction property of inequality, you can probably already expect what this is going to be. If x is less than y, then x minus c is less than y minus c. And if x is greater than y, then x minus c is greater than y minus c. And just a quick note, I haven't put or equal to, but because these work for less than and greater than, and we already know it works for equal to, then it works for all the inequalities. Now here's where things start to get a little bit different. First, we're going to do the positive multiplication property of inequality. So this one says if x is less than y and c is greater than 0, so some positive number, then x times c is less than y times c. And that works the other way as well. If x is greater than y and c is still greater than 0, then x times c is still greater than y times c. But that only works when you multiply positive numbers. Similarly, the positive division property of inequality says if x is less than y and C... I keep doing that. Alright, let's try this again. And C is greater than 0, then x divided by C is still less than y divided by C. And the other way works as well. If x is greater than y and C is still greater than 0, then x divided by C is greater than y divided by C. Now for the fun part, the negative multiplication property of inequality. So with this one, it says if x is less than y and C is less than 0, so some negative number, then x times C is greater than y times C. So what we're essentially doing there is multiplying both sides of the inequality by a negative number, and that, as you notice, changes the sign, the inequality sign. So it went from less than to greater than. So essentially, whenever you multiply both sides of an inequality by a negative number, it will switch the sign. Less than will become greater than, and it also works vice versa. If x is greater than y and C is less than 0, then x times C is less than y times C. Again, multiplied by a negative number, so we change the sign. Now for the last property. The negative division property of inequality pretty much does the same thing. If x is less than y and C is less than 0, again, a negative number, then x divided by C is greater than y divided by C. So we divided both sides by a negative number, so again, we change the sign. And if x is greater than y and C is greater than 0, then x divided by C is less than y divided by C. Alright, so two more properties. First property is the transitive property of inequality, which says if A is less than B and B is less than C, then A is less than C. Also, if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. So this is just like the transitive property of equality, but with inequalities. And the final one is the reversal property of inequality, which says if A is less than B, then B is greater than A. And if A is greater than B, then B is less than A. So it's essentially the law of symmetry, except you have to make sure when you switch them, you have to switch the inequality sign. So if A is less than B, then B is greater than A. You got to switch everything. And this will be a property you use usually at the end of a problem if your variable is on the right side, just like you did with the law of symmetry. Symmetry property of equality. Alright, so now we have an inequality. 13 is less than 2x plus 5, and we want to solve it. So first, let's make our table. Alright, so as usual, the first property is just given, because that was the problem that we were given. Next, we have to look here and see, just like as an equation, 2x plus 5, undo the addition or subtraction first. So we have to get rid of this plus 5, so we do the opposite. We subtract 5 from both sides. So 13 minus 5 is less than 2x plus 5 minus 5. And that property is, we subtracted from both sides, so it's the subtraction property of inequality. I abbreviated POI for property of inequality. Next, we have 13 minus 5 is 8, is less than 2x, and then 5 minus 5 is 0, so 8 is less than 2x is all we have there. That, as per usual, substitution. Next, we have to get rid of this 2 here. 2 is being multiplied by x, so we need to divide both sides by what's multiplying x. So we divide both sides by 2. So we have 8 divided by 2 is less than 2x divided by 2. And that's the positive division property of inequality. So, do the math out. 4 is less than x, so substitution. Then from here, you need to take the 4 is less than x, and you need to switch it so everything switches around to the other side, including the inequality sign. So you're going to say x is greater than 4, because what you did was 4 is less than x is the same thing as saying x is greater than 4. Because if 4 is less than x, then x is greater than 4. And the property there, to allow you to do that, is the reversal property of inequality. So this is one of the reasons I really stress the symmetric property with equations, is it's kind of obvious to know if 4 is equal to x, then x is equal to 4, but it's a little bit more difficult to realize that if 4 is less than x, x is greater than 4. And while you may realize it intuitively, when you go to graph it on, say, a number line, you may have problems because you see the less than symbol and just automatically go, oh, it's less than, I got a shade to the left. You need to remember x has to be on the left, and then you look at the sign from there. Now, normally from there I would then have you graph this inequality, but we're not going to do that today. Hopefully, I think you know enough from last year about how to graph inequalities, so we're not going to worry about that right now. So, now we're given the problem negative 3x minus 8 is greater than or equal to negative 2. So from here, once again, start with the table. As per usual, the first property is given. The next property, the next step, is like usual, we need to get rid of the subtraction happening first. So this is a minus 8, so let's add 8 to both sides of the inequality. So negative 3x minus 8 plus 8 is greater than or equal to negative 2 plus 8. And we added 8 to both sides, so the addition property of inequality. Next step, do the math out. Negative 3x minus 8 plus 8, those last two cancel to leave just negative 3x is greater than or equal to, and negative 2 plus 8 is a positive 6. So, substitution. Now the next step. Negative 3x is greater than or equal to 6. So, like usual, we need to divide both sides by what's multiplying x, the negative 3. So we say negative 3x divided by negative 3, and on the other side, 6 divided by negative 3. However, you need to remember, when you multiply or divide both sides of an inequality by a negative number, you need to change the sign. So it goes from being greater than or equal to less than or equal to. And this is the negative division property of inequality. Then from there, the negative 3's cancel to leave x is less than or equal to 6 divided by negative 3 is a negative 2. And that was substitution. Alright, so now time for the sponge. Here's an inequality, please solve it, and state the properties used. So put it into a table, show all the steps, show all the properties. So same thing we've been doing with equations, just with the inequality. That's it for the lesson. Once again, please make sure to take notes on the entire lesson. Make sure to go back and rate yourself on how you did on the sponge, because remember, you do have to attempt the sponge in order to get credit. And take a picture of your notes, submit them all to your backpack before class. Have a good night.